Something was already following us. Once, me and my family went into the forest in the middle of winter, not because we were brave or adventurous, but because we thought it would be peaceful, because snow has this way of making everything look quiet and safe, like it's hiding all the sharp edges of the world under a soft white blanket, and we wanted to get away from the noise of our lives for a few days, not knowing that the forest doesn't become calm in winter, it becomes patient. The road that led us there disappeared beneath drifting snow long before we reached the cabin, and by the time we parked the car, the sky was already turning that deep gray color that means night is coming early, and the trees stood around us like black pillars, tall and thin, and so close together that they looked like they were pressing in, listening, waiting for something to happen. I remember stepping out of the car and feeling the cold wrap around me instantly, biting through my jacket, filling my lungs with air that felt too sharp to breathe. And I remember how quiet it was, not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind where you realize nothing is moving. No birds, no wind, no distant traffic, just a heavy stillness that made every small sound echo too loudly. My little sister laughed, throwing a handful of snow at my dad, and for a moment it felt normal, but I noticed how the sound of her laughter seemed to get swallowed up by the trees instead of bouncing back, like the forest didn't want us to hear ourselves. The cabin was small and old, half buried in snow, with a single porch light glowing weakly against the dark, and as we carried our bags inside, I had this strange feeling that we were stepping into a place that didn't belong to us, like we were guests in a world that wasn't made for people anymore. That night, as the wind started to rise and snow began tapping against the windows, I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the forest, and that was when I first heard it. Not a howl, not a growl, but footsteps. Slow, careful, crunching softly through the snow outside, circling the cabin like something was walking around it, learning its shape. And I told myself it was just an animal, just a deer or a fox, just something normal, even though deep down I knew animals don't walk in perfect circles. Something was already out there, watching us. The snow was being disturbed. I didn't sleep much after hearing those footsteps, because once you know something is out there, really out there, your mind won't let you pretend anymore. And every time the wind shook the walls or a branch scraped against the window, I found myself sitting up in bed, staring into the darkness, wondering if this was the moment whatever was circling us decided to come closer. At some point in the night, the sound stopped. Not faded, not slowly drifting away. They just ended, like someone had cut them off. And that silence was worse than the noise because it meant whatever had been walking around the cabin was no longer moving. And if it wasn't moving, then it was standing still, waiting. When morning finally came, the sky was white and heavy with clouds, and the forest outside looked frozen in time, every branch coated in ice, every tree locked in place like a statue. And for a moment I almost convinced myself that the fear from the night before had been a dream. Then I opened the door. Fresh snow covered everything, smooth and untouched, except for one thing. Footprints. Not animal tracks. Not boots. Footprints that looked almost human, but wrong, too long, too narrow, pressed deep into the snow as if whatever had made them was far heavier than it should have been. And they formed a perfect circle around the cabin, exactly where I had heard the footsteps the night before. My dad tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just someone from another cabin nearby. But there were no other cabins for miles, and even he couldn't explain why the footprints didn't lead away. They just stopped, right in front of the door, as if whatever had been standing there had simply vanished. The rest of the day felt wrong. The forest was too quiet, no birds, no animals, no wind, and every time I looked between the trees I thought I saw movement. Tall, dark shapes sliding behind the trunks just out of sight, always there, always just beyond where my eyes could focus. By the time night fell again, the blizzard started. Snow poured from the sky so thick it erased the world beyond a few feet, and the cabin lights glowed like we were trapped inside a tiny bubble of warmth surrounded by endless cold. And somewhere out there, beyond the storm, I knew it was still watching, waiting for the snow to hide what it was about to do. It was standing between the trees. The blizzard grew louder as the night dragged on, wind howling around the cabin, snow slamming into the walls and windows so hard it sounded like fists pounding from the outside. And every few minutes the porch light would flicker, plunging everything into darkness before coming back on with a weak, sickly glow, as if even the electricity was afraid of whatever was moving through the storm. We were sitting in the living room when my sister suddenly went quiet. Not the normal quiet where someone is tired or bored, but the kind where they're listening to something no one else can hear. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing toward the window. At first, all I saw was blowing snow, thick white streaks rushing past the glass. But then something dark moved behind it, slow and deliberate, like a shadow swimming through the storm. And when it passed under the porch light, I caught a glimpse of its shape. It was tall, too tall. Its body was thin like it had been stretched, and its arms hung almost to the ground, bending in ways that didn't look natural. And for just a second I saw its face, pale against the darkness, with eyes that reflected the light like glass. It was standing just beyond the porch, watching us. My mom gasped, covering my sister's eyes, and my dad jumped up, locking the door even though I knew that wouldn't stop something that could stand that close without making a sound. The thing didn't move. It didn't knock. It didn't try to come in. It just stood there, as if it wanted us to know it had found us. Then slowly, it lifted one long arm and pointed at the cabin. At us. And I understood with a sick twist in my stomach that whatever this thing was, it hadn't followed us here. We had walked right into its territory. And now, with the blizzard trapping us inside and the forest swallowing every escape route, it had all the time in the world to decide what to do with us. The porch light went out, and when it came back on, the thing was gone. But I knew it hadn't left. It had only moved closer. It started imitating us. After the thing disappeared from the porch, none of us spoke for a long time. Because once you see something that shouldn't exist, something that doesn't fit into any normal explanation, it feels like saying it out loud might make it more real, might give it permission to step closer. And so we just sat there in the dim light, listening to the storm and pretending that the walls of the cabin were thick enough to keep out whatever was waiting in the trees. That was when we heard my dad's voice. "Hey, can someone open the door?" It came from outside, right where the thing had been standing. Every part of my body went cold, because my dad was sitting right next to me on the couch, his hand gripping my shoulder so hard it hurt. And when we all turned slowly toward him, his face was just as pale as I felt. "Don't," he whispered, barely moving his lips. The voice outside came again, clearer this time, sounding exactly like him, right down to the tired tone he used after a long day. "It's freezing out here, let me in." My sister started crying, and my mom covered her mouth, her eyes wide with terror, because whatever was out there didn't just look like something almost human. It sounded human. Perfectly. The voice began to move around the cabin, footsteps crunching through the snow, circling the walls just like the night before, and everywhere it went it kept talking, sometimes using my dad's voice, sometimes my mom's, sometimes even mine, calling out our names, asking us to come outside, promising everything was okay. I realized then that this thing wasn't just hunting us. It was learning us. And somewhere in the forest, hidden by snow and trees and darkness, it was practicing how to be one of you. It knew where we were sleeping. The voices didn't stop. They moved from room to room outside the cabin, stopping by each window, each wall, whispering through the storm, calling out our names in voices that sounded warm and familiar, like someone you love standing just beyond the door. But every time it spoke, there was something wrong in the tone, something too slow, too careful, like it was repeating words it had memorized instead of actually feeling them. Then it said my name. Not shouted, not whispered, just spoken softly, right outside my bedroom window. Come here, I'm scared. It was my sister's voice. She was sitting right next to me. I felt her hand squeeze mine so hard my fingers went numb, and in that moment I knew the thing in the forest could sound like anyone it wanted, and if we gave in even once, if we opened the door even a crack, it wouldn't matter who was really standing there. It would get inside. The footsteps stopped outside my window, and for a moment there was only the blizzard, and then the scratching started. Slow, deliberate. Something dragged its fingers along the wood, testing it, feeling for a weak spot, and every scrape sent a shiver through my bones because it wasn't trying to break in. It was trying to find where we were. My dad grabbed a flashlight and a hunting knife and moved quietly down the hallway, his jaw tight with fear, and even though every part of me wanted him to stay, I knew someone had to see what it was doing. When he shined the light out the window, the beam cut through the swirling snow and landed on something tall standing right against the wall. Too close. It turned its head slowly toward the light, and I saw that its face was wrong, like it was made of stretched skin pulled over something that didn't quite fit, and its eyes reflected back at us, empty and cold. It smiled, and I realized it already knew exactly where we were. It lured him outside. The smile on its face stayed there long after my dad shut the curtains, and I could still see it in my mind, stretched too wide, too patient, like it knew this was only the beginning. And as the storm howled around the cabin, I started to understand that whatever lived in this frozen forest didn't need to rush. We were trapped. Time was on its side. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. It was impossible to tell, until the voices outside stopped again, leaving us in a thick, suffocating silence that felt heavier than the noise ever had, and for a while we almost believed it had gone away. Then we heard a knock. Not loud, not desperate, just 3 slow, careful taps on the front door. My mom shook her head, tears running down her face, but my dad stood up anyway because whatever was out there had chosen him, and he knew it. I won't open it, he said quietly, grabbing his coat, but I'm going to see what it wants. Before we could stop him, he was at the door, slipping on his boots, his breath shaking, and when he opened it just enough to step onto the porch, the cold rushed in like something alive. We watched through the window as he stood there alone in the snow. Then from the trees, my mom's voice called out, "Come here, I need you." He froze. And even though he knew it wasn't her, even though he could hear her crying behind him, something about the voice pulled at him, tugging him toward the forest like invisible strings. Step by step, he walked away from the cabin, into the snow, into the trees. And no matter how hard we screamed, he never looked back. It was wearing his face. We stood at the door for a long time after my dad disappeared into the trees, screaming his name until our throats burned. But the blizzard swallowed every sound, and the forest stayed silent, dark and endless, like it had never given him back. My mom collapsed onto the floor, sobbing, and my sister, and I just stood there, staring into the white storm outside, knowing deep down that we weren't going to see him again. Not the way he had been. Hours later, when the knocking came, it almost made my heart stop. 3 slow taps. Exactly the same as before. "Open the door," my dad's voice said from outside. "I'm freezing." My sister shook her head violently, and my mom backed away, her face drained of color, because we all knew what that meant. Whatever had taken him was done with him. And now it was coming back. The porch light flickered on, and through the window we saw him standing there in the snow, his coat dusted with white, his head slightly tilted, just like it had been when the thing smiled at us earlier. But something was wrong. He wasn't breathing. His chest didn't move. And when he lifted his face toward the glass, his eyes reflected the light the same empty, glassy way the creature's had. "Let me in," he said again, perfectly calm. "You're not safe without me." I felt my stomach drop, because the thing wasn't pretending anymore. It wasn't even trying to hide. It was telling us the truth. It wanted one of us. The thing wearing my dad's face kept knocking, slow and steady, like it knew we were running out of strength to say no. And with every tap against the wood, I could feel the cabin itself trembling, not from the cold, but from whatever dark will was pressing against it from the outside. And even though I wanted to close my eyes and disappear, I couldn't stop staring at the door, because part of me was terrified that if I looked away for even a second, it would already be inside. My mom whispered prayers under her breath, her hands shaking so badly that she could barely hold onto my sister, and I could see in her eyes that she was fighting something deeper than fear, something older, the instinct to open the door for someone you love even when you know it will destroy you. And that was when I realized the creature didn't just copy voices and faces. It copied love. "Please," it said in my dad's voice, softer now, almost gentle, "I'm so cold. Don't you care about me anymore?" The words cut deeper than any scream, because they were designed to. And for a moment I saw my mom take a step forward before stopping herself. And I knew if she reached the door, it would all be over. I grabbed her arm, holding her back, and she looked at me like I was the one hurting her, like I was the monster for keeping her away from him. And that was when the thing outside laughed. Not my dad's laugh. Something deeper. Something hollow. "You understand now," it said, its voice slipping, twisting between tones as if it was struggling to hold one shape. "One of you belongs to the forest. That's the price." The lights in the cabin flickered, and outside the trees began to sway even though there was no wind, their branches bending inward, pointing toward the door like crooked fingers. And suddenly I knew that the creature wasn't just one being. The forest itself was alive. And it was hungry. The door finally opened. The knocking stopped, and that silence was somehow worse than anything the creature had said, because it felt like the moment right before something terrible happens, the breath held in the air just before a scream, and we all stood there, frozen, listening to the storm and the slow creak of the cabin settling as if the building itself was waiting to see what we would do. "I can't let it take you," my mom whispered, her voice breaking as she looked at my sister and me. And I realized in that moment that the thing outside had already won something, because it had planted its fear inside us, and fear makes people choose things they never would in the light. Before I could stop her, my mom stepped forward and unlocked the door. The cold exploded inside like a living thing, wrapping around us, stealing our breath. And there, standing on the porch, was my dad, or what used to be him, his face pale and still, his eyes shining like empty mirrors. "I'm home," it said. The forest went quiet. Even the wind stopped. My mom took a step toward him, tears streaming down her face, and I knew she wasn't walking to her husband anymore. She was walking into the forest's mouth. As she reached him, the thing's face twisted into something that wasn't human at all, skin stretching and cracking like ice, and long, dark shapes moved beneath it, trying to push their way out. And in that moment I understood the truth. It had never wanted to get inside. It wanted someone to come out. The thing wrapped its arms around my mom, and she screamed as the shadows from the trees surged forward, swallowing her, pulling her into the blizzard, into the frozen darkness beyond the porch. And just like that, she was gone. The door slammed shut behind us, and my sister and I were left alone in the cabin, staring at the empty snow where our parents had been, knowing the forest had taken what it wanted. But deep down, I also knew it wasn't done. Not yet, because we were still here, and the forest was still hungry. The storm didn't end after my mom was taken. It only grew quieter, heavier, as if the forest was holding its breath, savoring what it had just been given, and my sister and I sat on the floor with our backs against the door, shaking, listening to the soft hiss of snow sliding across the porch where our parents had stood only moments before, knowing that if we opened it again, there would be nothing left of them to find. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time didn't seem to exist in that place anymore. At some point, the knocking returned. Not loud, not demanding, just 3 gentle taps. "Come outside," my mom's voice whispered through the wood. "It's beautiful out here." I covered my ears, but the sound didn't fade because it wasn't really coming from the door anymore. It was coming from the forest itself, from every tree, every shadow, every drifting snowflake, and I realized then that the creature had never been just one thing. It was the forest. It was the cold. It was the emptiness that had waited there long before we ever arrived. Through the window, I saw movement between the trees, tall shapes standing in the snow, wearing faces I recognized. My dad, my mom, and others I didn't know, all of them frozen and still, staring at the cabin like statues carved from ice, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They weren't dead. They weren't alive. They were part of it now. The storm slowly began to fade as dawn crept over the forest, and for a moment the world outside looked almost normal again, white and quiet and empty. But when I looked closely at the snow, I saw footprints everywhere, circling the cabin, overlapping, thousands of them, all leading into the trees and none ever coming back. Rescue teams found my sister and me days later, half frozen and barely conscious. But when they asked about our parents, all we could do was shake our heads, because how do you explain that the forest itself took them? They never found the cabin again. Not on any map. Not on any satellite image. It was like the place had been erased. But sometimes, when winter is quiet and the snow falls just right, I still hear knocking in the night, 3 slow taps, followed by voices I love, calling me to come back to the forest. And the worst part is, a small part of me still wants to answer.